Marissa Thompson woke up to the sound of her children's laughter, echoing from the living room. The soft sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the small kitchen where she prepared breakfast. Her husband, Daniel, had already left for his morning meetings, but he always made sure to kiss her goodbye before leaving the house. That was the kind of man he was, always caring, always thoughtful. Her life seemed like a perfect balance between family, work, and community. Her job at the local library kept her busy, but it was fulfilling, and she always made time for her two young kids, Leah and Marcus, who were the light of her life. It was a quiet Wednesday morning when everything changed. She had just finished getting the kids ready for school when the doorbell rang. Marissa thought it was a neighbor or perhaps a delivery, but when she opened the door, two police officers stood on her doorstep. Their uniforms and expressions sent a chill through her body. The officers said that they were there to talk to her about a serious matter. They explained that she was under arrest for her involvement in a recent drug case involving a neighbor who had been arrested and accused of running an illegal operation. Marissa was in shock. She had no idea what they were talking about. She barely knew the neighbor they were referring to, and the idea that she could be linked to such a crime felt absurd. Despite her confusion and panic, the officers were firm. They explained that she was being charged with aiding and abetting a criminal operation. Marissa's heart raced as she tried to comprehend the situation. How could this be happening to her? She had always tried to live a good life and be an upstanding member of the community. She had no criminal record and certainly no history with drugs. She asked the officers if they had any evidence linking her to the crime, but they remained silent and insistent that she come with them immediately. As the officers handcuffed her and led her to the car, her mind raced with questions. How could this be happening to her? What had she done wrong? Her children were still in the house, oblivious to the events unfolding outside. They were too young to understand. But Marissa couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. She knew this could tear her family apart. Word of her arrest spread quickly through the neighborhood. By the time Daniel arrived home later that afternoon, it was all over the news. He was stunned and frantic, rushing to the police station to find out what had happened to his wife. Daniel was the mayor of their city, a respected leader in the community, known for his work in local politics. He had dedicated his life to serving the people, but now his wife was caught in the middle of something far beyond their control. As Daniel sat in the police station trying to make sense of what was happening, he felt a rising sense of dread. He knew he had to act fast to protect his family, but even as he worked with his legal team to get Marissa released, the weight of the situation hung over him. He didn't know how to fight this or even where to begin, but he was determined to clear her name and prove her innocence no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Marissa sat in her cell trying to stay calm. The uncertainty of her situation was overwhelming. She had no idea how this would end, but she knew one thing for sure: she had done nothing wrong, and she would fight to the very end to prove it. The following morning, the courtroom was already buzzing with whispers and murmurs as people filed in for the start of the trial. Marissa Thompson's case had become a media sensation from the moment of her arrest. The small-town mayor's wife, accused of a crime she insisted she didn't commit. The tension was palpable as reporters lined the walls, hoping to capture every detail of the unfolding drama. Marissa entered the courtroom with her lawyer at her side. Her heart raced with every step she took into the room, but she tried her best to remain composed for her family, for her children, who she knew were anxiously waiting at home, hoping for good news. Her lawyer, a seasoned attorney named Rachel Michaels, had prepared for this moment, but even she couldn't predict how the trial would unfold. The first thing Marissa noticed when she stepped inside was the judge. His stern face and cold demeanor sent a shiver down her spine. Judge Henry Mason had been on the bench for over 30 years. His reputation was both feared and respected. His rulings were often harsh and unwavering. Many had called him old-fashioned. Some even referred to him as out of touch with the modern world. But it was his unspoken biases that had many questioning his true ability to be fair. The rumor mill had long speculated that he favored certain types of defendants and sentenced others more harshly simply based on their race or background. As the trial began, Marissa's lawyer stood to make her opening statement. She presented the evidence that clearly showed Marissa's innocence. The charges against her were based on flimsy connections and weak circumstantial evidence, yet Judge Mason barely acknowledged her arguments. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on Marissa, and the way her lawyer spoke, he seemed distracted, uninterested, almost as if he had already made up his mind. When it was time for the prosecution to present its case, the tension in the room grew even more palpable. The prosecutor was a sharp and ambitious young lawyer, eager to make a name for himself. He focused heavily on Marissa's background, painting her as part of a larger criminal network. Despite the lack of evidence to support that claim, he emphasized her race and her involvement with certain individuals in the community, insinuating that her actions were part of a pattern of criminal behavior. Marissa's blood ran cold. As the prosecutor spoke, she had never been involved in anything like this, but the way he twisted the truth made it sound as though she were guilty of things she had never even considered. The audience watched on with rapt attention. Many of them seemed to agree with the prosecutor's narrative. Despite the lack of hard evidence, it felt as though Marissa's fate had already been decided. Judge Mason's attitude toward the case became more and more apparent with each passing day. He interrupted Marissa's defense lawyer multiple times, cutting her off before she could finish her arguments. His tone was dismissive, as if he were trying to hurry the proceedings along rather than listen to the facts. It was clear he had no intention of giving her a fair trial. By the end of the first week, the atmosphere in the courtroom had become toxic. The media had latched onto the case, and public opinion seemed divided. Marissa's supporters rallied outside the courthouse demanding justice, while others criticized the mayor's involvement in the case and speculated on the reasons behind Marissa's arrest. All the while, Judge Mason remained unmoved by the chaos around him, as if he were in complete control of the situation. As the trial continued, Marissa couldn't help but feel like she was losing more than just her freedom. She was losing hope with every passing day. The odds against her grew steeper and steeper, but she refused to give in. She couldn't allow herself to believe that her family's future depended on the prejudiced judgment of the man who had already made up his mind. As the trial continued, the pressure mounted on Marissa. Each day in the courtroom felt like a battle she was losing, even as her defense team tirelessly worked to present evidence in her favor. Rachel Michaels, her lawyer, had become increasingly frustrated by Judge Mason's dismissive attitude. The judge seemed to have no interest in the facts of the case. Instead, he appeared determined to expedite the trial, giving little weight to the mounting evidence of Marissa's innocence. His bias was becoming clearer with every passing day, and it was not just Marissa who noticed. Everyone in the courtroom could feel it. Outside, the public's interest in the case reached a boiling point. Activists began to rally, and protests grew louder, calling for justice for Marissa. On the steps of the courthouse, supporters held signs demanding her release, while local news stations broadcast the trial live, capturing every tense moment. But despite the growing outcry, the judge seemed impervious to the mounting pressure. It was as though he believed his ruling was inevitable, as if Marissa's fate had already been sealed before the trial even began. Marissa sat in the defendant's chair, her hands trembling, as she watched the prosecutor stand tall before the jury, spinning his narrative of guilt. The prosecution's case was weak, relying on circumstantial evidence and vague associations. They presented a neighbor, a former acquaintance of Marissa, who claimed to have seen her at a location connected to a drug bust. But the witness's credibility was questionable at best. Marissa's lawyer cross-examined the witness, pointing out the inconsistencies in his testimony. But Judge Mason cut her off, barely allowing her to finish before declaring a brief recess. It felt as though he had already made up his mind. Marissa's heart sank with each passing day. She knew that her chances were slipping away, but she refused to show weakness. She had to stay strong for her children, for Daniel, for herself. Every night, as she lay in her cell, she thought about the life she had built, the quiet moments with her family, the laughter of her children echoing in the halls of their home. She couldn't lose it all now. But then, something unexpected happened. On the fourth day of the trial, a breakthrough came. A former colleague of Marissa's, someone who had worked with her at the library, came forward with new evidence. She claimed to have overheard a conversation between the prosecutor and the key witness, one that hinted at a possible bribe being offered in exchange for false testimony. This revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The judge, for the first time, seemed caught off guard. He called for an immediate recess, and the entire courtroom buzzed with uncertainty. Was the case about to turn in Marissa's favor? Rachel Michaels immediately jumped on the opportunity, pushing for an investigation into the new claims. The witness who had come forward was credible, and the possibility of a bribery scandal could undermine the entire prosecution's case. Marissa sat in her chair, her breath catching in her throat. Could this be the break she had been waiting for? It was the first glimmer of hope she had felt in days. But even as the new evidence was presented, Judge Mason remained stoic, his face unreadable. The media frenzy outside continued to grow, but Marissa could no longer trust that the truth would set her free. Judge Mason's biases had already been laid bare, and now she had to face the very real possibility that he might ignore this new evidence as well. The trial had become more than just a fight for Marissa's freedom. It was a fight for justice, for accountability, and for the truth to finally prevail. The courtroom was buzzing with whispers as the recess ended, but Judge Mason's expression remained unchanging, his eyes cold and calculating. Marissa's heart raced as Rachel Michaels presented the new evidence, the overheard conversation about the alleged bribe. The defense attorney pushed for an immediate investigation, hoping that this revelation would not only weaken the prosecution's case, but also forced the judge to reconsider his previous stance. But Judge Mason, instead of acknowledging the gravity of the new information, simply nodded curtly and declared that the trial would proceed. His indifference to the scandal left everyone in the courtroom stunned. Marissa couldn't believe it. Was this truly happening? Despite the clear conflict of interest and the possibility of corruption, Judge Mason seemed intent on carrying forward with the trial as if nothing had changed. Daniel Thompson, Marissa's husband, sat in the front row, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. As mayor of the city, he had seen corruption in various forms, but nothing like this. His wife, the woman he loved and had built a life with, was being treated as guilty before even being given a fair trial. It didn't make sense. His position had allowed him to make a lot of changes in the community, but nothing he had done could seem to break the unyielding stance of Judge Mason. Behind the scenes, Daniel had already set plans into motion. He had called on trusted allies within the legal community, demanding answers and starting an internal investigation into the judge's past cases. He couldn't just sit idly by as Marissa's future hung in the balance. The community's trust in the justice system was at stake, and Daniel knew he had to act quickly. Meanwhile, Marissa sat in the defendant's chair, her hands shaking as she tried to focus on the proceedings. The tension in the room was suffocating. The defense team worked tirelessly to discredit the prosecution's case, highlighting the lack of direct evidence linking Marissa to any crime. But despite their best efforts, Judge Mason barely acknowledged their objections, instead allowing the prosecutor to lead the narrative in a way that painted Marissa in an increasingly negative light. In the days that followed, Marissa's anxiety grew. She could see it in the eyes of the jurors. They seemed uncomfortable, unsure of what to believe. The media circus outside the courthouse only made things worse. On one hand, she was the victim of a racist justice system, but on the other, her story was being used as a pawn in political games that were far beyond her control. As the pressure mounted, Marissa started to question whether anyone would truly see her as innocent in the end. Could the system she had trusted all her life be so blind to the truth? One afternoon, Daniel stormed into the courthouse with an urgency that startled even the court officers. He had just received word from a trusted contact. Someone had leaked a report that tied Judge Mason to questionable financial dealings in the past, particularly with certain developers who had significant influence over local politics. This could be the breakthrough they needed, but Daniel knew that it wouldn't be enough to convince the judge to recuse himself. He took a deep breath, preparing himself for what came next. He had one shot at making a statement that would not only defend his wife, but expose the deep-rooted corruption in the system. As he sat next to Marissa in the courtroom, his mind raced with plans. No matter what happened, he would ensure that the truth came to light. He would fight not just for her freedom, but for everyone who had been unjustly treated by a system that had failed them. Outside, the protests continued to grow louder. But for now, the real battle was inside that courtroom, and Marissa and Daniel knew that it wasn't just their lives on the line. It was the integrity of the entire judicial system. The days following Daniel's discovery of the leaked report felt like a whirlwind. The media had caught wind of the new developments, and the public scrutiny reached a boiling point. News outlets began to report not only on Marissa's trial, but also on the potential corruption involving Judge Mason. The damning report detailed financial ties between the judge and several influential developers who had cases pending in his courtroom. While the connection was circumstantial, it painted a troubling picture of the judge's impartiality and raised serious questions about his ability to fairly preside over any trial. As soon as Daniel learned about the leak, he knew he had to act. He couldn't wait for the legal system to catch up or for Marissa's case to drag on any longer. He called an emergency press conference, addressing both the public and the media. With Marissa's case now a national topic, Daniel knew that every word he spoke could either make or break their chances of turning the tide. His voice was steady, but his words were filled with urgency. He detailed the corruption report, laying bare the judge's past ties and emphasizing the importance of ensuring that Marissa's trial be fair and free of any undue influence. "This trial is not just about my wife's innocence," Daniel declared. "It's about the integrity of our entire legal system. If we allow a judge with these kinds of ties to continue presiding over cases, then we are all at risk of losing trust in our justice system." The press conference immediately caught the attention of political figures, legal analysts, and the public. Support for Marissa swelled. Protesters outside the courthouse were louder than ever, chanting for justice, demanding that Judge Mason be removed from the case. The energy was palpable, but Daniel knew that their fight was far from over. While public opinion had shifted in their favor, the battle in the courtroom was still ongoing. Meanwhile, Marissa felt both a sense of hope and dread. The revelation of Judge Mason's corruption was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it gave her the chance she had been waiting for, the opportunity to expose the truth and perhaps overturn the case. On the other hand, she feared that Mason, a man so entrenched in his power, would never back down, no matter the mounting pressure. She had seen firsthand how stubborn and cold he was in his approach to the trial. Would he be willing to face the consequences of his actions, or would he fight even harder to preserve his position? In the courtroom, things began to shift. Rachel Michaels, Marissa's attorney, demanded an immediate hearing to address the corruption allegations. Judge Mason initially resisted, trying to dismiss the claims as rumors, but the mounting pressure was undeniable. The courtroom was filled with anticipation as the hearing began. Daniel sat in the front row, watching his wife's fate hang in the balance. He couldn't help but feel a growing sense of anger at the injustice they had endured. But in that moment, something unexpected happened. The pressure on Judge Mason became too much for him to ignore. The weight of the media attention, the public outcry, and the growing evidence against him pushed the judge into a corner. With a stiff expression, he declared that he would recuse himself from Marissa's case, citing the appearance of bias. It was a small victory, but a significant one. Judge Mason's removal didn't mean Marissa was out of the woods yet. Another judge would be appointed, and the trial would have to start again from the beginning. But for the first time in weeks, Marissa allowed herself to believe that there was a chance for justice. As the courtroom emptied, Daniel turned to her with a small, encouraging smile. It wasn't over yet, but it was the first real step toward the truth. The news of Judge Mason's recusal spread like wildfire, and for the first time in weeks, a glimmer of hope pierced through the dark clouds that had hung over Marissa's life. The courtroom, once filled with an oppressive atmosphere, now buzzed with the possibility of a fresh start. A new judge, Judge Claudia Robinson, was appointed to oversee the case. Unlike Judge Mason, Robinson was known for her fairness and her reputation for listening to all sides before making a decision. The shift in the courtroom dynamic was immediate. Marissa, though exhausted from the emotional toll the trial had taken on her, couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. She sat next to Rachel Michaels, her lawyer, as the new judge took her seat on the bench. Judge Robinson greeted everyone with a calm and professional demeanor, quickly addressing the concerns surrounding the previous judge's involvement. After careful consideration and review of the facts, I have decided to recuse Judge Mason from this case. We will proceed with a fair trial, and I will ensure that all parties are given the opportunity to present their case without bias, Judge Robinson stated firmly, her voice carrying authority. Marissa's heart fluttered. For the first time since her arrest, she felt as though the scales of justice might finally tip in her favor. The proceedings began again, and Rachel Michaels wasted no time in presenting the evidence that had been overlooked by the previous judge. She painstakingly went over every detail, including the lack of any physical evidence linking Marissa to the crime and the weak testimonies that had been used to build the prosecution's case. The prosecutor, once so confident in his narrative, seemed less assured now. The pressure from the media, the public outcry, and the new developments had shaken him. As Rachel tore apart the prosecution's arguments, Marissa could see the cracks in their case. With the weight of corruption and bias now behind them, the prosecution struggled to maintain their grip on the narrative. Outside the courthouse, the protests continued, but the mood had shifted. What had once been a cry for justice for an innocent woman was now a call for accountability on a much larger scale. People rallied not just for Marissa, but for all those who had been wronged by a system that allowed corruption to flourish unchecked. Daniel, too, became an even more vocal advocate for reform, using his position as mayor to push for an independent investigation into the judicial system. His passion for his wife's case had fueled a movement, and now his voice was part of a larger conversation about justice, fairness, and the role of power in shaping the legal system. But for Marissa, it was still an emotional roller coaster. She knew that the battle was far from over. The trial was only in its early stages, and while the tide had turned in their favor, there were no guarantees. She spent her days in the courtroom, surrounded by the harsh glare of the media and the public's watchful eyes, trying to keep her focus on the one thing that mattered most, clearing her name. As the days wore on, the pressure on the prosecutor increased. He found himself facing mounting doubt about his case, with each passing witness and piece of evidence. The cracks in the prosecution's arguments became more visible, and the jury began to question the validity of the charges. Marissa, though nervous, felt her resolve harden. She had been fighting this battle for so long that it felt almost surreal to be given a fair shot at justice. In the quiet moments, when she was alone in her thoughts, she couldn't help but wonder how many others had faced the same biased system. How many innocent people had suffered because of corrupt figures like Judge Mason. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to dream of a life beyond a courtroom, a life where she could finally hold her children and return to the normalcy she had lost. The courtroom, once thick with tension, now felt different. The energy had shifted, and Marissa could sense it. Judge Claudia Robinson's calm yet authoritative presence was like a breath of fresh air. The atmosphere was no longer dominated by prejudice and corruption. Now, it was about the law, about truth. Every day, as the defense team presented their case, Marissa felt the heavy burden she had carried for so long begin to lift. Rachel Michaels, her lawyer, had been relentless. She methodically dismantled the prosecution's weak arguments, calling into question the credibility of their witnesses and pointing out the lack of tangible evidence. It was a far cry from the way things have been under Judge Mason. Marissa could see that the jury was beginning to take notice. They seemed more engaged now, more willing to listen and to consider the facts, not the prejudices that had once clouded their judgment. The turning point came when Rachel called in an expert witness, an independent forensic expert who refuted the prosecution's claims that Marissa had been in the location where the crime had taken place. The expert testified that the alleged forensic evidence tying Marissa to the scene was inconclusive at best. In fact, it was the kind of evidence that could easily be misinterpreted or tampered with. The room fell silent as the expert presented their findings in a clear and undeniable manner. Marissa could see the doubt creeping into the eyes of the jurors. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she might be able to walk out of this courtroom a free woman, But even as hope began to rise, Marissa knew that the prosecution wouldn't give up easily. They had staked so much on her guilt, and they weren't about to let her go without a fight. The prosecutor tried desperately to salvage their case, cross-examining the expert witness with questions designed to confuse and undermine the testimony. However, Rachel stood her ground, carefully guiding the expert's responses and ensuring that every point made was bulletproof. Outside the courthouse, the protests grew louder. Marissa had become a symbol of resistance, of the fight for justice against a broken system. Her story was being shared across social media, with people across the country expressing their support. It wasn't just Marissa's case anymore. It had become a national conversation about racial injustice, corruption, and the need for accountability in the legal system. Daniel had become a powerful advocate for reform, speaking to local leaders and using his platform as mayor to push for systemic change. Every day he held a vigil outside the courthouse, standing in solidarity with Marissa and the growing movement. Despite the attention, Marissa still felt like she was living in a dream. Every day as the trial progressed, she saw the walls around her begin to crumble. But she couldn't allow herself to get too hopeful, not yet. The jury still had to deliberate, and even though things were looking better, the weight of the entire trial hung over her head. She spent sleepless nights in her cell, praying for a miracle, wishing for the day when she would finally be reunited with her family. On the final day of the trial, after both sides had presented their closing arguments, the jury was sent to deliberate. It felt as if time stood still. Daniel was by Marissa's side, holding her hand tightly. He could see the anxiety in her eyes, even though she tried to hide it. It had been a long road, too long, but now it was up to the jury. "Whatever happens, we've already won," Daniel said softly, his voice filled with both love and determination. "We've made it this far. We won't stop fighting." Marissa squeezed his hand, nodding. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future where she could finally clear her name, rebuild her life, and fight for justice in ways she never thought possible. The courtroom was tense as the jury filed back in, their faces unreadable. The clock seemed to tick louder with each passing second, and Marissa's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She glanced at Daniel, who squeezed her hand gently, offering a reassuring smile despite the tightness in his own chest. The whole courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the weight of the moment hanging heavy. Judge Robinson called the room to attention, her voice steady. "The jury has reached a verdict," she announced, her gaze flicking briefly to the foreman. Marissa's eyes never left the jury as they stood, the tension palpable. She was afraid to hope, afraid that this moment would be another in a long string of disappointments. But in the pit of her stomach, she couldn't suppress the flicker of hope that had been building over the past few days. The jury foreman stepped forward, holding the piece of paper that would determine Marissa's fate. He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice firm but devoid of emotion. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Marissa Thompson, not guilty of all charges." For a moment, the words didn't fully register. Then, like a dam breaking, the reality of the verdict washed over her. Marissa gasped, her hands shaking as she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The courtroom erupted in a wave of emotion. Some cheered, others were silent in disbelief, but all eyes were on her. Daniel stood up, pulling her into a tight embrace, his face buried in her hair, as tears of relief and joy mixed with his smile. Marissa could hardly believe it. The years of pain, the struggle, the fear, it all melted away in an instant. She was free, truly free. As the court officers began to file out, preparing to release her, Marissa felt the full weight of the years she had lost. The tears she had fought back for so long finally fell. They were tears of joy, of vindication, and of a deep, aching sorrow for all that she had endured. Outside the courthouse, the crowd that had gathered to support her cheered loudly as she stepped out into the sunlight. Marissa raised her hand, acknowledging the crowd, but her eyes were on Daniel, who stood beside her, his pride in her more evident than ever. It was his strength, his unwavering belief in her, that had kept her going through the darkest moments. Together, they had weathered the storm. The media was relentless, and reporters crowded around, eager to capture every moment of Marissa's triumph. She answered questions, but her mind was elsewhere. She had missed so much: her children, the life she once had. But now she would get it all back. Slowly, the press surrounded Daniel, asking him about his role in the case and his push for judicial reform. But he never lost sight of Marissa. His eyes were always on her, always bringing her back to the reality of their victory. The phone calls and messages flooded in, support from family, friends, and even strangers who had followed her case. But it wasn't the accolades that mattered to Marissa now. What mattered was the future. A future where she could be a mother again, a wife again, and above all, someone who had been vindicated in the face of injustice. As she and Daniel left the courthouse, their hands intertwined, Marissa knew this victory was just the beginning. The battle had been long, but it was a battle that had changed everything. With the truth finally in her corner, Marissa Thompson was ready to rebuild her life and take her place in the fight for justice, not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced by a broken system.